The autumn wind whispered through the tall prairie grass, carrying the scent of sage and memories Henry Walker would rather forget. 10 years of quiet living on his small ranch outside Cheyenne had almost convinced him he'd buried his past deep enough. The weathered cabin he'd built with his own hands stood as testament to his new life, a far cry from the gunfighter they once called Wyoming Hawk, who'd left a trail of wanted posters from El Paso to Deadwood. The setting sun painted long shadows across his porch as Henry cleaned his father's old pocket watch, the only keepsake he'd allowed himself to keep from before. The timepiece hadn't worked in years, but the ritual of maintaining it gave his hands something honest to do. Better than the quick draw practice that had once been as natural as breathing. A distant rumble of thunder promised rain, and he thought about the cattle he'd need to check before dark. That's when he heard it, the soft crunch of footsteps in the dry grass. Henry's hand instinctively moved toward the revolver he still kept within reach, though hidden under a loose board by his rocking chair. Old habits died hard. But instead of danger, he saw a boy, couldn't be more than 12, thin as a rail and covered in trail dust. The child's clothes were torn, his boots nearly worn through, and his eyes held a haunted look Henry recognized all too well. "You Henry Walker?" the boy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. When Henry nodded, the child reached into his pocket with trembling fingers and pulled out something that caught the dying sunlight. A silver locket, its surface scratched and tarnished, hung from a broken chain. Henry's breath caught in his throat. He'd seen that locket before, had given it to Rachel Clark on a spring morning in '73, the last time he'd seen her alive, or thought he had. "Mama said you're my father," the boy said, holding out the locket. "She told me to find you if anything happened to her." Henry's world tilted sideways. Rachel had died in a fire at her father's ranch near Dodge City. He'd seen the burnt ruins himself, had helped bury what remained. He'd carried that guilt for a decade, knowing his enemies had found her because of him. But if this boy was telling the truth? Before Henry could form the questions burning in his throat, hoofbeats thundered in the distance. The boy's eyes went wide with fear, and he pressed himself against the cabin wall. "They're coming," he whispered. "The men who killed Mama, they think I know where it is, but I don't. I swear I don't." Henry's instincts, dulled by years of peaceful ranching but never truly gone, screamed danger. Moving with a speed that surprised even himself, Henry ushered the boy inside and doused the lamp. Through the window, he counted 5 riders approaching in the gathering dusk, their horses lathered and pushing hard. He recognized the lead man's silhouette, Frank Moore, a bounty hunter known for bringing in his targets dead more often than alive. The same Frank Moore who'd worked for the mining companies back when Henry had fought on the other side of that range war. "Listen close," Henry whispered to the boy, who'd pressed himself into the darkest corner. "There's a cellar under the floorboards behind the stove. Get in there and don't make a sound no matter what you hear. Don't come out until I call you." The child nodded, clutching the locket to his chest. As Henry helped him into the hiding space, the boy grabbed his sleeve. "I'm Daniel," he said softly. "Mama said to tell you she was sorry." Henry's mind raced as he replaced the floorboards and moved the rug back into place. Rachel alive all these years? A son he'd never known? And now Frank Moore, of all people, hunting the boy? The coincidences felt too neat, too calculated. But the locket was real. He'd had it made special in Cheyenne, had Rachel's initials engraved inside, which meant at least part of this twisted tale had to be true. The riders were close now, their horses' hooves like distant thunder. Henry checked his revolver. The weapon felt foreign in his hand after so long, yet somehow familiar, like greeting an old friend you'd hoped never to see again. If Frank Moore wanted the boy, he'd have to come through Henry Walker first. And while Henry had left the Wyoming Hawk behind, he hadn't forgotten how to fight. The night was about to get interesting, and somewhere in the darkness, truth and lies were tangled together like a rattler in the grass. Henry guided the boy to the back room, moving swiftly through the darkness of his modest ranch house. The kerosene lamp cast long shadows across the worn floorboards as he pulled a dusty carpet bag from beneath his bed. Inside lay the tools of his former life: ammunition, a second revolver, and a worn leather map case he hadn't opened in years. The familiar weight of the gear brought memories flooding back, memories he'd spent a decade trying to bury. "What's your name, son?" Henry asked quietly, keeping one ear trained on the approaching riders. The boy, thin and wary as a young colt, clutched the broken locket like a lifeline. His clothes were trail-worn but well-made, suggesting whoever had been caring for him had means, at least until recently. Daniel, the boy whispered. Daniel Marshall. The surname hit Henry like a physical blow, Rachel's family name. He wanted to ask more, but time was running short. The thunder of hooves had grown louder, and Henry could now make out the jingle of spurs and the low murmur of men's voices outside. Through the window, he counted at least 6 riders circling his property in the moonlight. Frank Moore's signature black hat was unmistakable, even after all these years. The man had gotten older, grayer, but no less dangerous. Henry knew Moore's reputation had only grown more vicious since their last encounter in Deadwood. Listen carefully, Daniel, Henry said, checking the load in his spare revolver. There's a tunnel under the house, dug during the border wars, follows the creek bed south for nearly half a mile. At the end, you'll find my horse, Storm, in a hidden corral. He knows the way to Martha's place. She runs a way station near the Kansas line. The boy's eyes widened. You're not coming with me? Fear crept into his voice, making him sound even younger than his years. Henry's heart twisted. The boy had Rachel's eyes. There was no denying it now. But there were too many questions, too many impossible pieces to this puzzle. I'll be right behind you, Henry assured him, though they both knew it for the partial lie it was. But first, I need to have a conversation with these men. Need to understand why they're really here. He pulled up the trapdoor hidden beneath his bed, revealing the narrow earthen passage below. The night air carried the smell of sage and prairie grass through the open window, along with the metallic click of weapons being readied. Frank Moore's voice rang out, sharp as a knife. Walker! We know you're in there. Send out the boy and we can all avoid making this messy. Daniel hesitated at the tunnel entrance, clutching the broken locket. Mama said, she said you'd know what to do with this. He pressed the locket into Henry's hand. Said it wasn't just a picture inside anymore. Henry's fingers found the hidden catch, and the locket's backing slid away to reveal not just the familiar daguerreotype of Rachel, but a thin piece of paper folded impossibly small. His hands shook as he carefully unfolded it. A map, drawn in Rachel's precise hand, showing a route through the Badlands to a place marked only with a cryptic symbol. Outside, horses stamped impatiently in the darkness. Frank Moore's men were spreading out, taking positions around the house. Henry knew their type. Hired guns, mercenaries who'd kill a child without hesitation if the price was right. Whatever secret Rachel had entrusted to their son, it was worth killing for. Henry pressed the map back into the locket and returned it to Daniel. Keep this safe, he said, helping the boy into the tunnel. Martha will know what to do next. She and Rachel, they had their own secrets. The sound of boots on his front porch made him glance up sharply. Go! Now, and Daniel, whatever happens, don't trust anyone who can't tell you about the Silver Rose. As he closed the trapdoor and slid the bed back into place, Henry allowed himself one moment of pure regret for the peaceful life he was about to lose. Then he checked his weapons one final time and moved toward the front room. Frank Moore was about to learn why they'd once called him the Wyoming Hawk, and why some legends are better left undisturbed. The floorboards creaked beneath Henry's boots as he moved through the darkened house, his fingers brushing the familiar notches in his old Colt. Through the window, moonlight caught the metal of gun barrels. At least 6 men surrounding his home. He'd chosen this isolated stretch of prairie precisely because it offered clear lines of sight in all directions, but now that advantage worked against him. There was no cover between his door and the barn, no way to circle behind Moore's men without being spotted. A sharp rap at the door made his jaw tighten. Henry Wilson! Frank Moore's voice carried the false friendliness of a snake oil salesman. Just want to talk about that boy of yours. No need for things to get messy. The words were belied by the metallic click of weapons being cocked outside. Henry's mind raced through his options as he positioned himself beside the doorframe. Martha's ranch was 15 miles north, and if Daniel kept to the tunnel, he'd emerge in the creek bed a quarter mile away. The boy would need at least an hour's head start. Time he'd have to buy with lead and blood. Been a long time, Frank, Henry called back, keeping his voice steady. Last I saw you was Deadwood 75 right before you lost 3 men trying to bring me in. He heard muttered curses outside. Clearly Moore hadn't told his current crew about that particular failure. Good. Let doubt creep into their minds. The night air carried the scent of sage and prairie dust through the window, mingling with the iron tang of gun oil. Henry breathed it in, letting memories of Rachel flood back. Her smile in the morning light, the way she'd sing to herself while mending clothes. Henry Clark drew the curtains tight against the gathering dusk, his weathered hands moving with deliberate care. The boy, Charlie was his name, sat hunched at the rough-hewn table, mechanically spooning beans into his mouth while casting furtive glances at the door. 10 years of peace shattered by a child's whispered words and a broken locket that now lay heavy in Henry's vest pocket. The silver was tarnished almost black, its hinges stiff with age, but he'd recognize Rachel Anderson's delicate engraving anywhere. Outside, the wind howled across the open plains surrounding Deadwood, carrying with it the restless bleating of cattle. Henry's small ranch sat isolated, a day's hard ride from town, exactly how he'd wanted it when he'd built the place. Now that isolation felt more like vulnerability. He'd caught glimpses of dust clouds on the horizon that afternoon, riders moving with purpose. The bounty hunters wouldn't be far behind. "Your mama," Henry said carefully, studying the boy's face for any trace of Rachel. "When did you last see her?" Charlie's shoulders tensed, his spoon scraping against the tin plate. "2 days ago, before the bad men came." His voice cracked. "She told me to run, find the man in the picture. Said you'd protect me." Henry's throat tightened. Rachel was alive, had been alive all this time. The revelation struck like a physical blow. The boy pulled something from his threadbare jacket, a folded piece of paper, its creases worn tissue-thin. "Mama said not to show anyone but you." Henry unfolded it with trembling fingers. The paper was covered in Rachel's flowing script, but the words were nonsense, strings of numbers and letters that meant nothing to him. In the corner, a crude drawing showed what might have been mountains or rock formations. A horse's whinny split the night, followed by the muffled thud of hooves. Charlie went rigid, his face draining of color. Henry was already moving, grabbing his Winchester from its place above the hearth. "Back door," he whispered, gesturing toward the kitchen. "There's a loose board in the floor, space enough to hide." The boy hesitated. "Go." Now, as Charlie scrambled away, Henry positioned himself beside the front window, rifle ready. The riders materialized from the darkness like wraiths, 5 men, heavily armed, led by a towering figure Henry recognized with a jolt of cold recognition. Frank Moore had been a Union Army captain during the war, now one of the most feared bounty hunters in the territory. The man had a reputation for bringing in his quarry dead more often than alive. Henry's finger tightened on the trigger. "Evening, friend, Fien," Moore called out, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "Apologies for the late hour, but we're looking for a boy. Run away from El Paso, his poor mother's sick with worry." The lie rolled smooth as honey off his tongue. "Seen anyone matching that description?" Henry forced his own voice to stay steady. "Been alone out here 3 days. No visitors." Moore's pause stretched too long. "Mind if we take a look around?" For the mother's peace of mind. Before Henry could respond, a floorboard creaked behind him. He spun to find Charlie frozen in the kitchen doorway, eyes wide with terror. In that instant, a shot exploded through the window. Henry dove, tackling the boy as glass rained down around them. More gunfire erupted, bullets splintering wood and thudding into walls. They crawled through the kitchen as the front door burst inward. "The cellar," Henry grunted, shoving Charlie toward a trapdoor half hidden beneath a worn rug. "There's a tunnel, leads to the creek bed. He dug it years ago, insurance against exactly this kind of night. Follow it south, find Daniel Walker's place. Tell him Henry sent you." The boy clutched his arm. "What about you?" Henry managed a grim smile. "I'll buy you time. Now go." As Charlie disappeared below, Henry positioned himself behind an overturned table. The first bounty hunter through the kitchen door took a round in the chest. The second managed to fire twice before Henry's bullet found him, but there were more coming. Moore's voice rang out again, closer now. "That's some fine shooting for a simple rancher." "Almost reminds me of someone I used to know, a man they called Deadeye Henry back in '65. The words hit like ice water in Henry's veins. No one had called him that name in a decade. Moore knew exactly who he was, which meant this was about more than just the boy or whatever treasure that coded message promised. This was about the past catching up at last. Henry chambered another round, mind racing. Whatever the truth was about Rachel, the boy, and that map, he had to survive this night to uncover it. Frank Moore's men were professionals, moving with coordinated precision to cut off escape routes. But Henry hadn't survived the war and everything after by being predictable. As boots thundered through his home, he retrieved a small package from beneath the floorboards. dynamite left over from well digging. The fuse sparkled to life beneath his trembling fingers. Time to remind them why they'd once called him Deadeye. The dynamite's blast shattered the night, sending splinters of Henry's beloved homestead raining across the prairie grass. In the chaos, he grabbed the boy and slipped through the smoke-filled darkness toward the barn. The child, who still hadn't told Henry his name, moved with an eerie silence that spoke of too much practice at running from danger. Behind them, Frank Moore's furious shouts cut through the din of confused gunfire. The barn's familiar shadows welcomed them as Henry quickly saddled his fastest mare, keeping one eye on the door. The boy clutched that mysterious locket so tightly, his knuckles showed white in the dim light. "Your mama," Henry whispered, hoisting the child onto the horse. "Rachel. Was she in Deadwood? Is that where you came from?" But the boy just shook his head, eyes wide with fear as hoofbeats approached. They burst from the barn's rear door just as flames began consuming the wooden structure. Henry had spent 10 peaceful years building this life, and now it burned behind him like a funeral pyre for his dreams of redemption. The prairie stretched endless before them, silver-touched by moonlight. He knew these grasslands better than Moore's men ever could. Every hidden creek bed, every patch of treacherous ground that could break a horse's leg. Dawn found them huddled in a narrow canyon, the boy finally sleeping fitfully against Henry's side. The locket lay open in his palm, its intricate engravings somehow familiar though he couldn't place them. Rachel had worn something similar, he remembered, but she'd died in that fire in Dodge City, or so he'd been told. The story had driven him to abandon his gunfighting ways and seek solitude on the plains. Now, studying the boy's features in the growing light, he saw hints of Rachel in the curve of his jaw, the arch of his eyebrows. A distant rifle shot brought Henry instantly alert. Moore's men were ranging out, searching methodically. They'd have to move soon, but first, he needed answers. "Boy," he said softly, gently shaking the child awake, "I need to know, who gave you that locket? Where did you really come from?" The boy's eyes flickered open, showing a wisdom far beyond his years. "Martha," he whispered. "Martha in Cheyenne. She said Mama trusted her to keep me safe until it was time." Henry's mind raced. Martha, Rachel's sister. He'd never met her, but Rachel had spoken of her often during their brief time together. If Martha had been protecting the boy all these years, she must know the truth about Rachel's fate. But Cheyenne was 4 days' hard ride across open country, with Moore's men between them and safety. The boy would never make it without food and proper rest. The morning sun cast long shadows as Henry studied their back trail through his old cavalry spyglass. No immediate pursuit, but dust clouds on the horizon suggested riders moving parallel to their path. Moore was trying to cut them off from Cheyenne, forcing them east toward more populated territories where his men could blend with the townfolk. Henry had seen such tactics before during the war. He folded the spyglass with a grim smile. Moore had forgotten who he was dealing with. "We're going to play a trick," he told the boy, who watched him with those unsettlingly familiar eyes. "Like the old Apache scouts taught me." Henry began gathering dry grass, planning to set a series of small fires that would mask their true direction. The boy helped without being asked, his small hands working quickly and surely. "Did your mama ever tell you about the Apaches?" Henry asked casually. The child paused, then nodded. "She said my father learned from them. That's how he stayed alive when bad men were hunting him." The words hit Henry like a physical blow. Rachel had told the boy about him, had wanted her son to know his father, even if they could never meet. But why the deception? Why let him believe she was dead? The answers lay in Cheyenne with Martha, but reaching her would require every trick he'd ever learned. As he worked, Henry's mind returned to that last night with Rachel, wondering what signs he'd missed, what truths had hidden behind her tears when she'd told him to ride away and never look back. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the prairie grass as Henry studied the distant horizon. He'd spotted dust clouds, riders moving fast and purposeful, exactly the kind of movement he'd been dreading. The boy, who Henry now knew was called Daniel, crouched beside him in the tall grass, his small frame nearly invisible among the swaying stalks. The child had proven remarkably resilient over the past day, never complaining even as they'd pushed their horses hard through the rough country. "We need to split up those tracks," Henry murmured, more to himself than to Daniel. He'd laid false trails before, but never with a child in tow. The bounty hunters were good, too good to be simple hired guns. They moved like military men, spreading out in careful formation as they searched. Something about this whole situation felt wrong, like a carefully laid trap rather than a simple pursuit. The broken locket weighed heavy in Henry's pocket. The sun hung low over the vast prairie outside Cheyenne as Henry Clark watched the bounty hunter's torches flicker in the growing darkness. He and young Daniel huddled in the abandoned barn, listening to hoofbeats circle ever closer. The boy clutched the broken locket, his small fingers tracing its tarnished edges. Henry's mind raced back to Rachel Walker's final words, spoken through bloodied lips a decade ago. Keep it safe, keep it hidden. He never knew what she meant until now. Frank Moore's gang had pursued them relentlessly for 3 days across the open range, driving them deeper into unfamiliar territory. The legendary Moore gang, notorious for hunting down anyone connected to the fabled Anderson Gold. Henry had heard whispers of their brutality, but seeing their handiwork firsthand at the ransacked homesteads they'd left behind turned his stomach. They weren't just after treasure, they enjoyed the killing. Through the barn's weathered slats, Henry watched Robert Taylor, Moore's scarred lieutenant, dismount and examine the ground. The man's reputation for tracking was well earned. He'd followed their trail despite Henry's best efforts to cover it. Daniel pressed closer to Henry's side, trembling. The boy hadn't spoken much since that night he appeared on Henry's doorstep, but his eyes held secrets, secrets worth killing for. "They're getting closer," Daniel whispered, his first words in hours. "Just like before, when they found Mama." Henry's heart skipped. Rachel had died in a fire 10 years ago. He'd seen the charred remains himself, but the boy's words stirred something in his memory. The smell of smoke that night, and boot prints in the mud that hadn't belonged to any townspeople. Had he missed something all those years ago? The locket held more than just memories, Henry realized. Its intricate engravings, when studied closely, formed a subtle pattern, one that matched the strange markings on the old Anderson ranch maps. Charlie Anderson's gold had become legend after the rancher disappeared 15 years ago, leaving only cryptic clues to its location. Henry had always dismissed the tales as frontier fancy, but Rachel's final message now took on new meaning. A horse whinnied outside, followed by urgent whispers. Henry recognized the voice of Martha Clark, his estranged sister who'd arrived in Cheyenne just days before with warnings about Frank Moore's gang. She'd been tracking them for months, she'd said, ever since they'd murdered her husband, a bank clerk who'd handled Charlie Anderson's estate. The pieces were starting to fit together, forming a picture Henry wasn't sure he wanted to see. "Your mother," Henry said softly to Daniel. "She worked for the Andersons, didn't she?" The boy nodded, eyes wide in the darkness. "She was their cook, before the bad men came." Another piece clicked into place. Rachel would have had access to every corner of the Anderson ranch, including Charlie's study where he kept his private papers. She must have discovered something worth killing for. The barn door creaked, and Martha slipped inside, her dress muddy and torn. "They've got us surrounded," she whispered, "but I know a way out, through the old cattle trails." She reached for Daniel, but the boy shrank back, clutching the locket tighter. Henry caught a glimpse of fear in his sister's eyes, not for their safety, but something else. Something about the way she looked at the locket made his hand drift to his gun. "You're working with them, aren't you?" Henry's voice was deadly quiet. Martha's hand moved to her hidden derringer, but Henry was faster. "Rachel trusted you. We all did. But you've been helping Moore track down anyone connected to the Anderson Gold." Tears streamed down Martha's face as she backed away. "Charlie was my husband," she hissed. "That gold belongs to me, not some dead woman's bastard." The confrontation exploded in a burst of gunfire as Frank Moore's men stormed the barn. Henry shielded Daniel with his body, returning fire as Martha disappeared into the chaos. Bullets splintered wood around them as they fought their way toward the back wall. Through the gun smoke, Henry caught glimpses of Robert Taylor's scarred face twisted with murderous intent. The truth about Rachel's death, the Anderson Gold, and Daniel's parentage would have to wait. Survival came first. In the chaos, Daniel's small hand found Henry's, pressing something into his palm, a small key that had been hidden inside the locket. The boy's eyes met his, full of trust and determination. Whatever secrets Rachel had died protecting, whatever truth lay hidden in the Anderson mystery, it all came down to this moment. Henry Clark, the man who'd spent 10 years running from his past, now faced a choice that would define his future. The night erupted into flames as Moore's men set fire to the barn, smoke billowing through the rafters. Henry's world narrowed to a single focus: getting Daniel to safety. The boy's connection to Rachel, the truth about his parentage, the Anderson gold, none of it mattered more than keeping this child alive. As they prepared to make their desperate break for freedom, Henry saw in Daniel's eyes the same quiet strength he'd loved in Rachel. Whatever came next, he would not fail them again. Through the smoke-filled barn, Henry and Daniel crouched low, the key cold in Henry's palm, as flames licked the wooden beams above. The sound of Moore's men shouting orders outside mingled with the crackling fire and frightened horses. Henry's mind raced through his years working these plains, remembering every hidden creek bed and shallow cave between here and Cheyenne. They'd need them all. With practiced precision, Henry led Daniel to the barn's back wall, where loose boards had been his secret escape route since the day he'd built the place. The boy moved silently, showing a survival instinct that spoke of hard lessons learned too young. As they slipped into the cool night air, the prairie stretched before them like a dark ocean, tall grass swaying in the wind that fed the growing inferno behind them. They made it 50 yards before the first shots rang out. Henry pushed Daniel into a shallow depression, shielding him with his body as bullets whizzed overhead. The familiar weight of his Colt pressed against his ribs, but drawing it meant acknowledging that the peaceful life he'd built was truly over. When a bullet splintered the earth inches from Daniel's head, the decision made itself. The firefight that followed would be talked about in Deadwood saloons for years to come. Henry's reputation hadn't been exaggerated. His shots found their marks with deadly accuracy, while Moore's men discovered too late why the name Deadshot Henry had once struck fear across the territories. But it wasn't pride that drove his aim. It was the trembling boy pressed against his side, clutching Rachel's locket. As dawn approached, they found temporary shelter in an abandoned line shack near the creek that marked the old Anderson property line. While Daniel slept fitfully, Henry studied the key in the dim light. Its worn brass surface bore an inscription he recognized: the mark of a Cheyenne locksmith who'd died years ago, the same man Rachel's father had trusted with his most valuable possessions. The pieces started falling into place. Rachel's father, Old Man Anderson, hadn't lost his fortune in bad investments as everyone believed. He'd hidden it, trusting only his daughter with its location. The night Rachel died, she must have split the clues between the locket and the key, ensuring that only the right person could piece them together. But why give them to a boy who couldn't be her son? Morning brought the sound of approaching riders, but these weren't Moore's men. Henry recognized the steady gait of Frank Miller's horse, his oldest friend from his ranger days, now Cheyenne's sheriff. Frank had always suspected Henry's true identity but had kept his peace, respecting the quiet life his friend had built. Now he brought news that changed everything. "Martha Anderson's alive," Frank announced without preamble, dismounting carefully to avoid spooking the boy. "Rachel's sister, the one everyone thought died in that fire 10 years ago. She's been hiding in El Paso, protecting something. Or someone." His eyes fell meaningfully on Daniel, who stood in the doorway, Rachel's features suddenly unmistakable in his face. The truth hit Henry like a physical blow. Martha had been Rachel's confidant, the only one who knew about their relationship. When Rachel died, Martha must have taken her sister's son, Henry's son, and hidden him away. Now, with Moore's men closing in on the Anderson fortune, she'd sent Daniel to the only person who could protect both him and his inheritance. But Moore's gang wasn't acting alone. Someone else was pulling the strings. Someone who'd waited a decade to claim what they believed was rightfully theirs. As Henry watched Daniel sleeping, he realized that the key in his hand unlocked more than just a hidden fortune. It unlocked the truth about Rachel's death, about the fire that had supposedly killed Martha, and about the powerful people who'd orchestrated all. Dawn painted the prairie gold, the same color as Daniel's hair in the morning light. Henry knew their journey was far from over, but for the first time in 10 years, he felt the weight of his past lifting. He had a son. He had purpose. And somewhere between here and El Paso, Martha Anderson waited with the final pieces of a puzzle that had cost too many lives already. The plains stretched endlessly before them as Henry Anderson and the boy Charlie rode hard across the open grassland, their horses' hooves thundering against the drought-hardened earth. Behind them, a cloud of dust marked the relentless pursuit of Frank Moore's bounty hunters. The locket bounced against Charlie's chest with each gallop. That simple, broken trinket that had started everything, now carrying secrets Henry still couldn't fully comprehend. 3 days of running had taken their toll. Henry's wound from the ambush outside Cheyenne was beginning to fester, the crude bandage soaked through, but he couldn't stop, not with Charlie's life hanging in the balance. The boy had barely spoken since that night at Henry's ranch, but his eyes held the same determined fire Henry had once seen in Rachel Taylor's gaze a decade ago. They crested a rise overlooking the meandering North Platte River, its waters running low in the late summer heat. Henry reined his horse to a stop, scanning the horizon with practiced eyes. The setting sun cast long shadows across the plains, and in the distance he could make out the faint lights of a ranch. The Clark spread, if he remembered correctly. Robert Clark had been one of the few who'd shown him kindness when he'd first settled in these parts under his assumed name. "We'll make for Robert's place," Henry told Charlie, his voice rough from trail dust. "But first, I need you to tell me everything you know about that locket. The whole truth this time." The boy's fingers closed protectively around the silver pendant, and Henry saw a flash of fear cross his young face. "Your mother, Rachel, she didn't die in that fire like everyone said, did she?" Charlie shook his head slowly. "She told me to find you if anything happened to her. Said you'd understand when you saw the locket. But then Mr. Moore's men came and—" The boy's voice cracked. Henry's mind raced, piecing together a decade of carefully constructed lies. Rachel had been alive all this time, hiding, protecting whatever secret was worth killing for. At the Clark Ranch, Robert's wife Martha took one look at Henry's wound and Charlie's exhausted state and ushered them inside without questions. As she cleaned and dressed Henry's injury, Robert stood watch at the window, rifle ready. "Frank Moore's bunch passed through last week," he said grimly, "looking for a woman and her boy. Said she stole something valuable." Henry's hands trembled as he finally examined the locket properly. The intricate engravings on its surface weren't decorative at all. They were coordinates, leading to something in the high country near Deadwood. "Rachel was always too clever for her own good," he murmured. The piece had been deliberately broken, he realized, its two halves forming a code only when joined with its mate. "She's in El Paso," Charlie whispered that night, huddled close to the fireplace. "Working as a seamstress for Daniel Walker's wife Susan. She said if anything happened, I should bring you the locket and tell you where to find her." But Mr. Moore's men were watching the house, and when she tried to leave, tears welled in the boy's eyes. The next morning brought more riders, not Moore's men, but Margaret Anderson, Henry's sister, whom he hadn't seen since taking his new identity. She'd been tracking them since Cheyenne. "Rachel contacted me months ago," she explained. "She knew they were closing in. The thing they're hunting, it's not gold or silver. It's evidence. Documents that could bring down half the cattle barons in the territory." Henry felt the weight of years of deception lifting. Rachel hadn't betrayed him by faking her death. She'd been protecting him and their son from men who would kill to keep their secrets buried. The coordinates in the locket led to a cache of papers proving how Moore and his associates had built their empires on murder and theft. 2 weeks later, they rode into El Paso at dawn. Henry found Rachel alive but weakened, hidden in a root cellar beneath Walker's store. Their reunion was bittersweet, a decade of lost time between them. But as Charlie embraced his mother, Henry saw the future beginning to take shape. Moore's empire was crumbling, his crimes exposed by Rachel's meticulous documentation. The boy who had arrived at Henry's door with a broken locket had led him not to buried treasure, but to something far more precious: the truth about his past and the family he thought he'd lost forever. Standing in the warm El Paso sun, Rachel's hand in his and their son between them, Henry Anderson finally understood that some legends aren't about gold or glory. They're about the courage to face the truth, no matter the cost. The rugged plains that had been his refuge now stretched before them like a promise. There would be no more running, no more hiding behind false names. The notorious gunslinger was gone, replaced by a man who had found his way home through the love of a brave woman and the trust of a remarkable boy. As autumn painted the grasslands gold, they began building a new life together, their story becoming part of the greater legend of the American frontier. The first winter on their new ranch tested them all. Henry spent long hours teaching his son the ways of the land, while Rachel's quiet strength held their small family together. The boy who had arrived with nothing but a locket and desperate hope now flourished under their care, his smile brightening even the coldest mornings. They named the spread Broken Locket Ranch, a reminder of the twisted path that had brought them together. As spring thawed the plains, word reached them that Moore's empire had completely unraveled. His former associates, facing prosecution, began revealing decades of corruption that stretched from El Paso to Deadwood. Rachel's documentation had sparked an investigation that exposed not just Moore's crimes, but a web of corruption that had ensnared several territorial officials. The truth of her supposed death and years in hiding became part of official record, clearing Henry's name in the process. Their peaceful existence drew others seeking refuge. Martha, a young widow from Dodge City, arrived with her 2 children, looking for work and a fresh start. Henry hired her as their housekeeper, recognizing in her eyes the same determination he'd seen in Rachel during her years of secret resistance against Moore. The ranch became a sanctuary for those needing to rebuild their lives. The boy, growing stronger each day, showed an uncanny talent with horses that reminded Henry of his own youth. Together they worked the spring roundup, father and son moving in perfect rhythm as they guided the cattle across the vast grasslands. Rachel watched from the porch, her medical practice now serving the surrounding ranches, her gentle hands healing both bodies and spirits. Frank, the old sheriff from Cheyenne who had helped expose Moore's operation, became a frequent visitor. His gruff exterior softened around the children, and his stories of the changing frontier reminded them that their world was evolving. The wild days of gunfighters were giving way to a new order, one built on law and community rather than violence and fear. One autumn evening, as sunset painted the prairie in shades of amber and gold, Henry found Rachel in their garden, tears streaming down her face. In her hands was a letter from Susan, her sister in Deadwood, announcing the birth of a daughter, a niece Rachel had thought she'd never live to see. The simple joy of family, once denied them both, now flowed as freely as the creek that watered their land. The broken locket, carefully repaired, hung above their fireplace, a testament to the power of truth over deception. Its presence reminded them that sometimes the greatest treasures aren't gold or silver, but the bonds forged in adversity and strengthened by love. The map the bounty hunters had sought so desperately had led not to material riches, but to something far more valuable: a family reunited and a future reclaimed. As their second year on the ranch drew to a close, Henry watched his son teaching Martha's youngest to ride, passing on the skills he'd learned with such pride. Rachel's medical practice had grown, her reputation for healing drawing people from as far as Dodge City. Their home, once a refuge, had become a cornerstone of the community, a place where second chances weren't just possible, but promised. The legend of the Notorious Gunslinger faded like tracks in wind-blown sand, replaced by stories of a different kind, tales of redemption, of family found, and faith restored. The plains that had once seemed endless now felt like home, their boundaries marked not by fences but by the love that had brought them all together. In the end, the greatest treasure wasn't what they'd found, but what they'd built. A life where truth and trust had finally overcome the shadows of the past. Winter returned, but this time they faced it together, their ranch a beacon of warmth in the vast prairie night. The boy who had arrived with nothing now slept soundly, surrounded by family both blood and chosen, while outside the wind sang ancient songs of hope and renewal across the endless grasslands of their home. As spring unfurled across the plains, the ranch flourished under the combined efforts of their unlikely family. The boy, now confidently answering to Charlie, had grown stronger and more assured with each passing season. His nightmares of pursuit had faded, replaced by dreams of cattle drives and future harvests. Henry, once the feared gunslinger known only as the Shadow of El Paso, found himself settling deeper into the role that fate had chosen for him: father, protector, and pillar of their growing community. Rachel's clinic continued to draw those seeking healing, but it served another purpose now: a network of information that kept them aware of any threats approaching from the territories. Through her connections, they learned that the last of the bounty hunters who had pursued Charlie had met their end in a shootout near Deadwood, their obsession with the legendary treasure having led them to turn on each other in desperation. The truth about Charlie's mother had emerged gradually, like spring water from thawed ground. Martha, Henry's lost love, hadn't died as he'd believed.